Okay, folks, so we'll go ahead and get started. Um, First thing I want to do is let you know that we have a sponsor of ZWO, which is a company who makes astrophotography cameras, telescopes, and accessories like electronic autofocusers, electronic filter wheels, things like that. And we just want to give them a shout out and thank them for helping us with the equipment that we're going to use today. So just get that out of the way, and we'll go through and be using some of their equipment here in a little bit. So first off, what I want to do is go over some very basic things. And many people, the first question they ask is, hey, what's the perfect telescope for a beginner? I mean, we're going to get into some basic astronomy stuff here, but it all rolls in together. You'll see how it comes together in a little bit. But the first, that's usually the first question. What's the best telescope to get? There is no such thing as a best telescope. You get a telescope based on what target you want to look at or what target you want to shoot, okay? So for instance, I see a DSLR over here, like a basic Nikon or Canon type camera. Those typically have a very wide angle lens, right? Those are really good for shooting things like the Milky Way. All right, you go out at night and you're just going to shoot a big swath of sky. And if you've ever been out to a dark sky and seen that, band of stars in the summertime, and it's just really sort of amazing on just how much there is out there that we can't see with our eyes, especially when we live around light polluted areas. But those types of cameras, we're talking about the lens there, is very good for that type of object. Now, there's different types of objects for astrophotography and astronomy in general. So one of the things is planets, right? They're the closest things to us. But guess what? As far as their relationship in the sky, they're also the smallest objects in the sky. So that means you need a telescope that has considerable magnification to see those clearly or to even image them. So that, believe it or not, is one of the most difficult things there is to image in astrophotography is a planet. All right. I'm going to go over the types of telescopes here in a little bit and show you which ones are good for which targets, and then we'll go into some different things after that. But the next thing is that's a little bit bigger is galaxies. All right, you might think, well, galaxies are really way out there. I need a really powerful telescope. No, actually, you don't. One of our nearest neighbors, the Andromeda Galaxy, is 2.5 million light years away. So the light that we're seeing now that's hitting our cameras and our eyeballs whenever we look through to see that is 2.5 million years old. Okay, that's when it started, and it's ending up here. All right. The Andromeda Galaxy, if you could see it with your naked eye, is 6 times larger than the full moon. That's a pretty big object. All right, and I have some pictures here I'll share with you here in a little bit, but just to give you an idea, then there are things like, the distant galaxies, which are a little smaller, and you need kind of like a medium-sized telescope for those to really get those well, which are, and the one thing that differs between the telescopes, you may think, the diameter or the aperture of a telescope is the most important thing. But believe it or not, it is the focal length. The length of the focal, of the optics between the primary mirror or the primary lens and the eyepiece or the sensor. Okay, so whenever that telescope is focusing that light down to a point, that is the focal length from where it starts to where it ends. This type of telescope is a Schmidt-Cassegrain, and believe it or not, it has the longest focal length of anything up here. So it's going to be used for things like planets and distant galaxies and things like that, smaller objects. But other things that are much closer to us which are in the Milky Way, are nebulas and, you know, a lot of different structures like, you know, there's different types of nebula. Okay, there's reflective nebula. There are supernova remnants, things like that. That you know, we see that. Just to me, those are the most beautiful things in the sky, and I prefer to shoot those because they are closer to us and they are in the Milky Way. They are generally much larger objects. So, if you're interested in imaging something like that, you need something kind of like this telescope right here. Now, this is one that ZWO helped us to get, and this is a very short focal length. I think this one is about 300 millimeter focal length, something like that. So it has a very wide field of view. All right, so that's what we're going to talk about next is the field of view. The field of view is directly related to the focal length of the telescope, and if you're doing visual, it would be the focal length of the telescope and the eyepiece together. All right. If you're doing imaging, it's the focal length plus the sensor size. So the larger sensor you have, the bigger the field of view you have in the sky. All right. So we'll cover some more of that here in a little bit as some examples. Any questions on that so far? Okay. So I do have some things here I want to pass around. These are some sample images that I've taken out of my front yard down in Brownsville. And I'm just going to pass these around. And on the back of most of them, there are tags that kind of tell you what they are and how far away they are, what type of object they are, and so forth. So I'm just going to, let's see. Do I got a young gentleman that might be willing to come up here and pass these around? All you got to do is just kind of hand them out randomly. Would you like to pass them out? Thank you. So I'm using these as examples to show the different types of objects that there are to image. All right, and then you can pass them around, whatever you want to do there. But let's see here. All right, so the focal length, like I said, it directly affects your field of view. All right. Most of the objects that I like to image take a very wide field of view. For instance, Andromeda, it requires a very short focal length like this telescope. All right, I had a telescope much like this one. Okay, this is technically a Newtonian refractor, reflector. And when I tried to image Andromeda, I would have had to done 6 panels and stitch them together to get that whole picture. All right, so that just kind of gives you an idea how big that was and the difference between one telescope and another. So let's see here. All right, so I'm trying to find some stuff here, make sure I know where stuff's at. The next thing I want to go over is the type of mount. All right, we have several different examples up here for the different telescopes and the different mounts. And the first one I'm going to show you is a Dobsonian. All right, that is this one right here. This is a very simple stand for a telescope. It's basically a Newtonian reflector where the mirror is down here and the eyepiece is up here. You can image with these, and these are very cost-effective ways to get into astrophotography. Now, the thing is most of these do not track, which means as the Earth turns at night and you need something to move along with the stars or the object as the night goes, okay? Because you can see, you know, at the beginning of the night, you know, the moon's over here, at the end of the night, it's over here, right? So this is basically a manual telescope. People use these to image planets and so forth because you can kind of do that, but you have to be really quick and make sure that it's stable. But you can put a camera on here. They have, oh, Dalen, could you do me a favor? Go into the members room in the closet and get the the phone holder on. Oh, it's on the closet. Anyhow, I'm going to show you something that is something for starters who want to use their phone to image. And believe it or not, the cameras on today's phones are really good. All right, but you can have a bracket that holds the cell phone on here, and you can line your camera up and take pictures of objects through a telescope with a cell phone. All right. You can also use get adapters to mount a DSLR, different things like that. So there's a lot of different ways you can get started. But I just wanted to go over this. This is a very basic mount, and you typically just move it like this, but you have to know what you're looking at. All right. How do you find the objects? Okay. You either know how to star hop, which means you are familiar with the night sky, or you can use an application like Google Sky Map, for instance. Google Sky Map, you pull it up on your phone and you point it at an object in the sky and say, hey, what is that? And basically, it gives you a map of the sky. There we go. Yeah. But this is the this is the phone mount, and it kind of goes around here like this. And oh, there's a bracket there. Anyway, it typically goes on an eyepiece there. But it would hold the phone, and then you can adjust it to where the eyepiece would line up with the camera lens. But I just wanted to show you that. But this is a very easy way to get started. So yeah, you can use these Newtonian reflectors with cell phones or DSLRs. You can get adapter brackets to mount them on the eyepiece holder. So just something that's very good for beginners. I'm going to go ahead and move this down here. So this little guy is more for visual than anything. And I want to show you this type of mount. This is what's called a fork mount. It is a computerized go-to mount, unlike the other one where you kind of had to know where you were looking. This one is good for taking pictures of planets and the moon and things like that because you don't need very long exposures for those. You actually use very short exposures for things like planets and so forth. But the longer the what we call the deep sky objects, the nebula, the galaxies, those require many hours of exposure over the night, and I'll explain how we get that in a little bit. But these types of mounts aren't really good for that. You'd have to get what they call a wedge and have it track, because something that many people don't think about is as the objects are going across the sky and you have a mount, they would actually rotate because of the way the Earth is, and it is round, by the way. But yeah, if you were to look at an object over here, as it goes across the sky, it'll rotate like this. So we use what we call a German equatorial mount, and it's a little bit different. So this one here is what we call an alt-azimuth mount, altitude and azimuth. Altitude is this way, azimuth is this way, all right? So the problem with these is they're good for certain things, which is planets, moon, sun, solar, stuff like that. But otherwise, for long, like deep sky astrophotography, they really aren't going to work very well. All right, any questions on that? So remember the question I asked at the beginning, what's the perfect telescope? You can see the variety we've already talked about and the differences with each of them and just what you can and can't do with some of them. So a lot of people go out and they buy this buddy, all right? Big, long focal length, and let's see here. I mean, doesn't that just look cool, right? I mean, just imagine pointing this thing, up in the sky and like, I can shoot anything with this, right? Well, this thing has a focal length, I think, of, where's it at? I think this one is about 1,800 millimeter. Oh, there it is. 2,000 millimeter focal length. All right. So this would be very good for planets. Like I said, some distant galaxies, things like that. It's fine. It is on an equatorial mount, so it'd be very good for shooting distant galaxies, things like that. But if you wanted to shoot a nebula or something larger, you're not going to get it. You could, but it would take you a very much longer time to do that. And then there's a lot more processing on the end because you're going to only get pieces of a larger object, and then you need to get software to stitch all those pieces together, which is called a mosaic. All right. So, like I said, a lot of people go out and they buy the biggest, baddest telescope they can find, and then they find out that's not really one I wanted because I wanted to shoot something like Andromeda, or I wanted to shoot some of these nebula that you see going around in these pictures, and you can't do it. All right. So, any questions so far? Yeah.
How come it takes like a smaller focal point between the lens compared
So,
to the larger one?
so if you imagine looking through a straw, okay, the question was, why does the longer focal length reduce the field of view? I think is basically what you're asking.
Yeah.
If you look through a straw, okay, you go to Denny's at night after the star party and you're looking through a straw and it's long and skinny. Well, guess what? You're only going to see a little bit if it's a really long straw, right? If you look through a short straw that's kind of short and fat, you're going to see a lot more coming out that end. So that's the thing. That's the whole concept there. But very good question. Thank you so much. This is where it comes is this is all question and answer too. So feel free if you have a question, just raise your hand and we'll get to you. But yeah, that is the field of view aspect. You've seen the pictures we passed around. Any thing jump out at you there? Did you get to see the differences between the galaxies, how far they were versus the nebula? And so those nebula, the nebula things, those were all shot with this telescope right here. It has a focal length of 280 millimeters, so it's a pretty wide field of view on that. And everything on there is, most of those are larger than Andromeda. So they're very big swaths of sky, all right? So let's see. The next thing I was going to talk about was, okay, we covered the mounts, the German equatorial mount. I do want to show you this. I'll show you on this one. So at night, when this thing is tracking an object across the sky, all right, and by the way, it is not balanced. This is one thing you got to do before you're able to image with one of these things is you got to balance it. Ta-da! That's my trick for today. Anyhow, it's balanced in two axes, this way and this way. So you can see how it falls down this direction because the mirror is down here and the mirror is very thick and heavy. All right. So the way we'd fix that, we just move the mirror up towards the front a little bit. And we'll see if that worked. Okay, that helped. So the German equatorial mounts, you have to balance. All right. that keeps the strain on the motors at a minimum. So they're very small motors and they're not really powerful, but if it's balanced, it's really not, working on too much. So what I was going to show you here was this is typically the way they track. All right, so we have two axes. We have an RA axis, which is right ascension, and we have a declination axis. All right, and this one, this axis here is RA. This axis is the declination. All right, so pretty much what happens, correct me if my brain gets wired backwards here. Yeah, anyway. It's easier when you just do this stuff from a computer and you just send the instructions and let it do it all. Because when I'm sitting here doing it by my hand, it doesn't work always the same way because I'm looking at it backwards. But what happens is the computer will find the object and then it'll track it across the sky like this. All right, and you can see how the orientation of the telescope would stay with an object as it moves across the sky this way, as opposed to one of the alt-azimuth scopes that would go across, and this would not let it, this will keep the image from rotating as it's captured during the night. So that brings me to the next thing, capturing the image. Now, before I mentioned the DSLRs and shooting things like the Milky Way, and we call those nightscapes sometimes, and you can use a basic tripod. All right, you can set it on a block wall and whatever you want to do as long as it's steady. All right, so many of the images we see, with the stars and the really deep rich colors, those are generally very long exposures. All right, however, with a regular tripod, you're only good taking about a 10 to 15-second exposure at most, and then what happens is the stars will start to trail. All right, so you might have seen pictures where people took a camera and they pointed it at Polaris, which is the North Star, and you get these star trails that just go right around Polaris, right? It's a pretty cool shot. Well, those are generally very long exposures. Okay, they're using probably a lower ISO or something like that, and they're just opening their lens and letting it sit there for an hour or something like that. Or the other way you can do it is you can take a lot of little exposures and then stack them to create one big one, which comes to my next topic, which is stacking. All right, how do you get 32 hours of exposure on a target when there's only 8 hours of night? Our computers, we basically use little PCs or some type of mini computer to run these, and it connects to the camera. The camera takes a picture, it saves it, then it takes another picture, saves it, and does that all night long. Then we take all those pictures in the morning, or whenever we get to it, and we run it through software called stacking software. That stacking software takes all of those pictures, puts them together, and turns it into very one long exposure. All right. So if a DSLR only has a 60-second exposure, I'm just using this as an example. You can't take one longer than 60 seconds for whatever reason. All right. Or you take your 15-second exposures and you want to stack those, you can do that. But a lot of times with our astrophotography cameras, we can take 5 or 10-minute exposures at a time, and we don't need as many pictures, but we still get all that data. All right, so if you think of it this way, if you're sitting here, and I'm going to call this a light bucket. All right, that's a common term of affection we use for our telescopes. It's a big old light bucket, right? Because all the photons are just coming in here and they're filling this thing up, right? So they hit the sensor on a camera. That sensor has pixels. Each one of those pixels is a little tiny light bucket. All right. Now, the thing is, different sensors have different sensitivity, they have different size pixels, and so forth. I don't want to get too technical, but I'm just going to kind of give you an idea of how it sort of works. Each pixel will sit there and a photon will hit that pixel and it turns it into an electron. So every time a photon hits, an electron is created, so it creates a charge, and that turns it from a black pixel to a white pixel. Now, depending on how many photons hit that pixel, determine if it's jet black or bright white. Okay? All sensors are monochrome, black or white. However, color cameras have red, green, and blue filters over those pixels. All right, so the cameras, the digital cameras, then have software in them that take that and turn them into a color image by combining those red, green, and blue filters of all those different pixels. All right, so that's what makes a color camera. So if you take 4 pixels, you're going to have a red pixel, a green pixel, a green pixel, and a blue pixel. That's called a Bayer matrix, and that's what makes the difference between a color camera and a monochrome camera. Now, the thing is, with all the sensors, like I was saying, was with those photons hitting those pixels, all right, if you have the lens open for, say, 10 seconds, there's not going to be very many photons hit, all right? But if you have that shutter open for, say, 5 minutes, there's going to be a whole lot more photons hitting each of the pixels and coming up with the data, all right? So that's what we're collecting. We're collecting data. And that data makes the charge, and then that makes the image that we then stack. So I'm going to go into a little bit of how the, oh, hang on a second here. So the monochrome cameras that we do use monochrome cameras, and they are actually more sensitive than the color cameras. All right, so there's 2 differences there that, we're going up from the DSLR type cameras to these astrophotography cameras. All right, like this here's a ZWO 2600 mm, which has the same sensor size as a DSLR, but it is a little round thing that looks kind of strange and is specifically designed for astrophotography. The other thing is most cameras, the sensors get hot if you're taking very long exposures. All right, so these have a lot of these have coolers in them. All right, they have a mechanical cooler that will cool the sensor, and typically you can get down to -10 or -20 degrees Celsius below ambient temperature. All right, so if it's 60 degrees out, this thing can take it down to, well, it's usually in Celsius, so it'd be like, it'd take it down like 20 degrees, something like that. So that helps reduce the noise in the sensor. The heat of the sensor can generate noise. So now what we're going to talk about is signal to noise ratio. All right, the reason why you might want to have a very long exposure is you're reducing the noise. You're going to have more signal, which is the actual photons that are legit from what you're trying to image. And then there's the background noise, which is random light from, atmospheric diffraction, things like that, or even the sensor temperature. The newer sensors that are cooled and so forth, they don't have any like read noise really compared to the older ones. And so that's what we look to do is we are looking to increase our signal to noise ratio as much as possible to get the best image. And whenever the software stacks all those different images, what it does is it compares one to the other, and it says, "Oh, I want to, look at these photons as signal because they kind of match up." So whenever you're stacking it, it's looking for similarities between each picture. right? And it stacks it and it says, okay, this is signal. The ones that don't match, it kind of writes that out as noise. It sort of, they sort of zero each other out whenever the stacking is happening. And oh, that breeze feels good. So any questions on that? I know I got a little technical there, but I wanted to kind of explain how that works. Yes.
When you stack, does it increase the resolution of the image?
No. There is a little bit more advanced thing where you dither and drizzle. So if you're dithering, the computer will go every so many frames, for instance, and it may move the telescope just a few pixels or just a little bit. All right, and what that does is it kind of randomizes the signal to noise in between the images. And then there's drizzle when you're processing, which can actually, it can increase like the pixel size of the image, but you're not really going to get any more data out of it. It's still going to look the same, but it's just it's a way of helping to reduce some of the noise. So this one is the ZWO ASI 2600 Duo. This is a color camera, but it has a guide camera also built into it. This is one that we recently acquired for the observatory. This is what we use for our electronically assisted astronomy, which is pretty much, it piggybacks on top of the 24 telescope that we have, 24-inch telescope we have up here, and we do live stacking with this. So we have it plugged in while it's pointed at a target, and the software like SharpCap, for instance, will start live stacking the image as long as we're pointed at it, and we have it cast to a TV in there that you can see live. But it's pretty cool. But this one also has an electronic autofocuser. All right. So when I am imaging, I run everything from my office and then I go to bed. Well, guess what? Focus can change over the course of the night as the temperature changes. All right. Or if you have an electronic filter wheel, the focus changes between each filter. All right. Because there's different offsets there. But it's really handy to have something that can help your telescope focus to the sensor of the camera. Because think about it, unless you're sitting there with a monitor beside this telescope and are sitting there able to, turn this focuser around, you can't tell if it's actually in focus or not. And the computer, which is this little mini PC we got on here, can do a better job assessing a star and telling you if it's sharp or not. And what it does is it takes several images and it adjusts the focuser by so many steps each time. So it'll take it and it'll move it up here, and it looks like a parabolic graph. All right. So it looks at a star and it measures the star's size. And then it'll move it down again, and that star will get smaller, and then it'll get smaller and smaller. And then as it goes past that focal point, the star will start to get bigger. Okay? So what it does is it uses an algorithm to calculate the optimal focus based on all the different points that it measured at the different focal points. So does that make sense? All right. So a couple other things I want to show you. This is one of my other, this is what's called an image train. All right, this is the back side of the telescope. This is what you put on the back side of the telescope. I have a focal reducer on this one, a rotator. Then there is, let's see, then I have an off-axis guider, an electronic filter wheel, and then finally the camera. The electronic focuser would be actually on the telescope, so this part I actually take out of the scope whenever I put it away, because I don't want this to break off, because this can get very expensive. The rotator. What do we need a rotator for? Any guesses?
To adjust it.
Would be the, like you said, as
So the rotator wouldn't be for that. That would be the equatorial mount. All right. So think of this. Last night, I imaged the Crab Nebula. All right. 3 days go by with clouds. Get another night that's clear. Well, I go ahead and put this thing back in my telescope and I want to image the same object some more. Well, if they weren't aligned, if the sensor isn't aligned the same as it was the first night, stacking is not going to be as good because it's going to shrink it down and not be able to crop the image to where I get all of the full frame of the picture that I was taking. So what this does is it says, okay, this object is at this location and you're shooting it at 45 degrees. All right. So it'll shoot that and it'll turn the camera the next time I'm out to align for the first time I was taking pictures. So it's very handy. You can do it manually, but I highly recommend a rotator. Then the next thing we have is the off-axis guider. When we're doing our imaging with these types of mounts and the computerized go-to mounts, we have to guide. And guiding, because these things are not precise, all right? Unless you're spending $10,000 or $20,000 on a mount, you need guiding. And what it does is there's another piece of software that uses a second camera to watch the stars as that mount moves across the sky. All right, and say it's moving, but there are little imperfections in the gears in here which can cause it to kind of go off track. Well, the guiding software uses a second camera, and this little thing here is what we call a guide camera, and it goes into this little circle here where there's a prism. The prism takes part of the light coming into the sensor of the camera, but it redirects it up to this camera so it can see the same stars, and that allows the guiding software, which we usually call something like PhD2, which is guiding software. And PhD2 can say, okay, I'm going to watch every 2 seconds to see if you're still on track. And if it sees that the mount has deviated a little bit by the stars not going in the expected path, it'll make slight adjustments to the mount so that it does stay there. And you can take those long 5 or 10 minute exposures. All right. The next item I have on here is an electronic filter wheel. All right. This is a monochrome camera, and in order to use the monochrome camera, you need filters. You need red, green, blue filters, obviously. There's something called a luminance filter, which is clear, which is just all white light. And then there are narrowband filters, which are sulfur, hydrogen, and oxygen. So a lot of those pictures you saw that were going around, if you saw the blue and the orange and things like that, those were narrowband images. And sulfur, hydrogen, and oxygen reflect a different wavelength of light. So your eye can't see that wavelength. The camera can through a specific filter. So that monochrome sensor is getting just is picking up just the wavelength of light from those elements. All right. Well, then whenever we stack them and process them, we then take those black and white images from the sulfur, hydrogen, and oxygen filters, and then we map them to red, green, and blue for something that our eyes can actually see. So depending on how you map the sulfur and the hydrogen, like you can map sulfur to red and hydrogen to green and oxygen to blue, which is a common mapping, okay? And that's how you get those beautifully colored images like that. Now, if you took a picture of some of these objects, these narrowband objects, with a red, green, and blue filter, you're not going to see them because the wavelength isn't there. Okay, there's nothing visible in the visible spectrum coming from that area of space. So that's why we use some of these filters, and that's why I like to use a monochrome camera. Now, I mentioned the guiding a minute ago. On this telescope, I don't have room for an off-axis guider because I only have a 55 millimeter back focus from the focal reducer here, which means on the focal reducer, the sensor has to be exactly 55 millimeters in order to get a sharp picture. So on this one, I use this as a guide scope. You can pretty much use anything as a guide scope. All right, this is just a cheap 60 millimeter guide scope and a basic camera that I got off of Amazon, and nothing fancy, but it works. You know, I mean, it's just you run the same software and everything, have the right drivers, and I use this, like I said, because I can't fit a off-axis guider on this one. Now, what are the benefits of an off-axis guider? If you think about it, this has a focal length of 240 millimeters. All right. You want to have a guide scope that has at least 1/3 the focal length of your primary scope. All right. The reason being is because the closer your guide camera is, your guide scope is to your primary, the more precise the tracking is going to be. So if you have a really long focal length telescope, the guiding must be much more precise than a short focal length. The reason being, this is seeing a very wide swath of sky, right? Well, you're going to see tens of thousands of stars in one image from this thing. You may see a couple dozen stars in an image on this thing. So guess what? Guiding is going to be much more significant on a long focal length, because if you have those, couple dozen stars in that image and that thing goes off track, you're going to see it much more prevalent in those few stars than you are in the thousands of stars here. All right, so that's why the longer focal length. The off-axis guider is going to have a guide scope that is exactly the same length as your primary scope. All right, so I know we're covering a lot of different things, and I'm just trying to go over. Some of these are basic concepts, but some of them are a little more advanced, and I'm just trying to touch base to give you all a good general handle on things. But I do want to take a round. Let's see. Dalen, would you want to help? Just take that around and let people take a closer look at it. So Dalen's going to take my one image train. Like I said, this is a monochrome image train that I use on my 12-inch Meade, which is a very long focal length. It's actually a 3,000 millimeter focal length, which is bigger than this one. But it's great for doing, some very small nebula. There are some small nebula that are kind of faint, and the monochrome camera is very good at picking those up. Okay, I'm going to put this back on here. Any questions so far? Yes?
Do you have any experience with smart telescopes?
That was coming up next. Sort of. Oh, there it is. Okay.
I brought my C-Star out for that.
Okay. Well, the first thing I wanted to kind of go over, this is a new mount that I just got. This is what's called a Solar Quest, and this is my solar telescope, but you basically just push a button on here and it GPSs. It'll find the sun automatically. You just hit that button and give it a few minutes and it finds the sun. I think the battery's dead on it right now, but they have these types of mounts here also for like DSLRs or mirrorless cameras that you can get, and it's pretty much point and shoot sort of thing that you can use, and it'll track and help you with longer exposures. All right, but so Dalen has what's called the C-Star, and I'm going to switch him spaces. I'll go down there and I will let him explain this. Ah,
I can go handheld.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Just put that one on.
The road?
That's for the recording.
Okay.
I guess I'll mute.
Just make sure you picking me up on there. All right. So the Sea Star is basically all of this in one little box. The sensor, the telescope, all of the software needed except for how you actually control it. You would use your cell phone or a tablet to control it. I'll have it set up later so I can show you guys pictures. I'll try to do a little bit on the moon before dark, but it really shines after dark. Now, with these little smart telescopes, the one downside to them is that they're very limited on what you can do. You're not going to take 5-minute exposures. You're only going to get 30 seconds tops. When he was explaining the difference between a German equatorial and an alt-az mount, this is an alt-az mount. That also limits things. You will get field rotation in the picture. So eventually, if you shoot for hours and hours and hours, you're going to see the different frames create like a little rotation in it. But for stuff like this, when you're just showing people things in the night sky, you can get a good looking shot in a minute just to say, hey, there's the Ring Nebula, or there's the little dumbbell, stuff like that. But you can also, with this smart telescope, save all of the data, take it to your computer and process it as if you were with one of these. So you can still get the practice in. And that's where I think it shines. This one is made by the same company that makes these cameras. So the software plays very well with each other. There is a separate app for this. If you wanted to go a step further with the smart telescope thing, there's also the ASI Air, which is a little Raspberry Pi-like device you just set on the telescope, and that's your computer that controls everything. The apps between the two are very similar. Let's see, stuff like the Dwarf 2, I have one of those as well. Very similar, but the Dwarf has an advantage where it has a very wide field, so you can get like a nightscape shot, but also get a nice zoomed in shot on whatever your object is. And all of them so far that I've seen come with a solar filter. So you can take pictures of the sun. Let's see what else about them. Well, they're very exciting devices to get started with. If you just want to dip your toes in, they're not expensive. This guy is only $500 compared to the rest of this. But you can get in and you can start practicing processing with this, and then move on to the bigger and better setups to get way more. What's up? Between that one and the Dwarf, what one do you prefer?
Ah.
That
one?
The Dwarf has other limitations. The algorithm it uses to find things in the night sky isn't as good. This, as long as the power button is pointed east when you first turn it on, and it's level, it has to be completely level, it'll find whatever you tell it to point at, right off the bat. But the Dwarf, it takes a little bit of fine tuning to get it to go wherever you want it. And the imaging through that is pretty phenomenal.
It's
I mean,
honestly, with using that, it's like using an iPhone's camera. Point and shoot. Really. The only thing you can really do is tell it, hey, I want 10-second, 20-second, or 30-second exposures. And then there's a little planetarium software in there where you can pan around the sky and just say, hey, go there and take pictures of that, and it'll do it.
Will it do longer than 30-second exposures?
Not at this point, no. Yeah.
Which of the telescopes would you say is best for, say, like observing a nebula or finding a nebula?
It's not necessarily a telescope per se. If you want to do bigger nebula, like the North American Nebula, stuff like that, you want to go more with a setup like this. This is wide enough for that.
And also, if you want to say shoot Andromeda, the galaxy, this is the setup you'd want. That is way too zoomed in. If you want to do the Ring Nebula, you'd go with that. Any more?
Great questions, by the way. One other thing I wanted to show you here real quick. I've been talking about computers and what we use to control these things. Hang on a second. All right, I think I got it. See this little box here? This is a little mini PC. It's a full-blown PC running Windows 11. It has, I think, 8 gig of RAM and a little processor and a 500 gig drive. But this runs the Nina software, the PhD2, and some other things that we have going on. But I have this mounted right here on the side of the telescope. It weighs about 5 ounces, 8 ounces maybe, something like that. It's not very heavy, but that's all you really need to control it. Dalen mentioned something called an ASI Air. That is a proprietary computer that is made by the ZWO company, and it's pretty much automatic where you just connect to it with your phone. It has its own built-in Wi-Fi and so forth, and it makes things really easy for a beginner. This is a little bit more advanced because there's things that, you know, that one is kind of limited, but this is for a little bit more features if you want to do some different things. But I just wanted to bring that up and show you that this is one of the mini PCs that we use to run it. Oh, here we go.
So this is the ASI Air I was talking about. Now, you primarily shoot with a computer, right?
Yes.
Nina? I use this. And it's wireless. And the nice thing about it, too, is the database on it's pretty huge. So, you're not going to run out of things to shoot. But it's fairly simple to use. The only thing that's kind of annoying is all the updates that happen. But that's just about every computer thing. But nice thing is, too, this has its own Wi-Fi. So you can use you have to use your tablet to do anything with it, but you can also tie it into your home Wi-Fi. That way it can be outside and you're sitting inside on your couch. Or in his case, in his office.
Yeah. So I have my mini PCs just connect to my home Wi-Fi, and I sit in my office and I remote to them, just remote desktop to them and run them. But one thing I want to point out on this. Do you see this rat's nest up here? All these cables? Because I got the mini PC, I got a USB hub, because I need USB cables that go to the camera, this camera, the rotator, the electronic filter wheel, and the autofocuser. All right? That's a whole lot of cables. This thing, there's also power cables that go to the camera and other things, but this has 4 power cable connectors. It has a USB hub built in. So this is also nice because it helps you with managing cables, because then all you need to do is buy the shortest cables you need to go from one device to the other. So thank you for that. But I do want to touch on something else. You mentioned about the database on there.
Yeah.
A lot of people ask, well, how do you know what to shoot? Or how do you find what to shoot? Well, you got to do a little research, okay, and kind of know what you're looking for. But if you go on some websites like AstroBin or different things and just start searching for objects, all right, they're gonna come out. But Nina, the ASI Air, they have a database in them that you can say, okay, I want to find out what is above the horizon tonight between these hours. I want to find galaxies specifically, or I want to find, bright nebula, and it'll give you a list, and it'll actually show you the little arc of how they're coming up above the horizon and going below the horizon. All right. So that's kind of what he was talking about on the database, and that's how we find the objects. We just kind of say, okay, I want to shoot the Crab Nebula tonight, and I put it into the sequence, and I tell the sequence, okay, I want you to shoot, 6 sulfur filters. I want to shoot 6 hydrogen filters, 6 oxygen filters, and repeat until dawn. That's just a basic type thing, okay? It'll automatically change the filters. It'll automatically run the autofocus. It'll automatically do everything. And then I just go to bed. All right, so that's kind of the neat thing about these type devices. Go ahead.
For figuring out what to shoot at night too, there's also using Stellarium, a free planetarium software. I'm not kidding with you when I say there's a few times where I'm like, I don't have an idea, so I just open up Stellarium, just find a spot in the night sky and go, oh, that area looks cool, so I'll just shoot that. And usually in there is a named deep sky object that you can find, and then you'll find it on one of these, or a Nina.
Yep. So that's really, we're going on an hour here now, so we've made your ears bleed long enough. Any other questions? Was this something you'd like to do again? I mean, we could get into some more advanced topics. We're also thinking about doing some live sessions online, actually going through the software like Nina, or even maybe showing examples of the ASI Air, where we could live stream some things and have a question answer that way. I think maybe Google Meets or something. We may be able to do like a Zoom session or something. But are these things that you think would be of interest? Okay. So right now I'm just going to go ahead and wrap up. And if you want to come up here and check out any of the equipment we have setting out, ask questions, feel free. But thank you all for coming and attending today. It was a pleasure to meet you all. And thank you, Dalen. And thank you, Brian. Brian Crawford here is the director here at Mingo. And he has been the one on our audio video today. So thank you to him as well. You all have our good evening. You're welcome to stay. We're going to be doing some solar observing here now in the 10-inch bay. And then as it gets darker, we're probably going to open up the 24 and do some electronically assisted astronomy and some other fun stuff. So please stick around. Thanks.